And I'll say this in my practice and in my experience with women, one of my goals with them is to actually get them to eat more, because I get women who have been eating 1,100 calories for 4 decades and they're wondering why they're gaining weight, and the things why initially, was an adaptive response. They lost the weight, they were feeling better, and then they've just done it for so long that now it's become a maladaptive.
Welcome to Hormone Happy Hour. We are your hosts, Yasmin and Kea. And in 2012, we started a company called Bia that's dedicated to empowering women to take control of their health and to really understand their hormones.
And in the process, we've learned so much from different experts in the space, and we cannot keep that information to ourselves. So here we are sharing it with the world, because everyone deserves healthy and happy hormones. So Yasmin, the show is called Hormone Happy Hour, so we have to know, what are you sipping on this morning?
Well, I know you know this, but I'm slightly obsessed with coffee and caffeine. But I make this drink all the time. I will stick to one espresso, so that's my way of not ODing on caffeine. So I'm drinking basically a homemade espresso iced latte. And what I love about it is that I'll put a collagen, like a grass-fed collagen. I was trying to remember the brand. I think it's, Ancient by Dr. Axe?
Ancient Nutrition.
Yes. That's right. The vanilla. Yep. So I'll put it in there with a frother and mix it, and it's like my jam. I love it. I love it so much.
And is the collagen flavored, or is it plain?
Yeah, it's flavored, vanilla flavor. So I'll put like half a scoop, and it gives me the best kick. Like, honestly, it's gotten to a point where I prefer making coffee at home than going out, which was never the case back in the day. So I'm slightly obsessed with this. It might be sharing a lot about it on Hormone Happy Hour over here.
Yeah, well, one thing I'm amazed by is that it doesn't matter the weather, the temperature. You are an iced coffee girl.
It's true. Kea, even when I lived in New York, it'd be like, even right now in LA, it's like raining, it's cold. I am still drinking iced coffee. That's so funny. Yeah.
I love it. Love it. I've definitely gotten more on iced coffee since we've known each other and been hanging out.
So tell me, Kea, what are you drinking?
So I'm really I did have my one espresso this morning too, but I'm now drinking this. I think it's called Detox by Peak, and it's their electrolyte mix, but it has hyaluronic acid. It has a few other things for glowing skin. And I don't know if it's placebo, but when I do have it consistently, I do notice that my skin is a little more glowing. So, and I love Peak products. I think they're awesome.
I love Peak. Yeah, Peak tea. And for people who don't know what it is, I only love it. I learned it from you and Drew, and it's like so easy to do, right? It's basically like tea crystals that you put with water. Yeah, so fascinating.
Yeah, it's so easy. Take a little sachet with you. Same with these electrolyte mixes, super easy to use. But yeah.
I feel like we're an ad. This is not sponsored. They did not. We just actually like them, so.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I wanted to ask you, because I know that you are super dialed in on your sleep now. That has been something that you've been working on for the past almost 2 years, I would say. Can you walk us through that a little bit? Like, what have been the major changes that you've made to, and I think you're sleeping pretty good now. Is that right?
Big time. I never used to sleep. And I know I talk about this a bit on my podcast, but like, I used to stay up late with work, and I think my body is just trained to work at night and maybe only get like 5 hours of sleep. And at that time, before I met you, before I met Drew, so people who might not know, my husband is Kea's brother. She's my sister-in-law. They have been in wellness for decades, so I have been learning so much for them. And yeah, sleep has been the biggest needle mover for me. But I'm now sleeping. So a couple of changes at work, I'm now sleeping on a more consistent time. Believe it or not, you guys, like I legit will fall asleep by 10 p.m. Old Yasmin, that would never happen in a million years. So I think the consistency actually helps. And also, and you can maybe talk about like why this is important, but not really having bright light at night. I remember Drew was mentioning that, and he would see that like my energy would kind of pick up if it was like 10 o'clock, I'm out working, the lights are on, and I could just go for another few hours. But I think the light shifts were huge, and being okay with sleeping. Like, honestly, I thought, we all have this like narrative, we got to wake up so early and like work. And, obviously, even in my old jobs, like I had to do that. And now that we're running our own business, it's like, I could sleep till 6, 7. It doesn't kill me that I'm not up working out at 6 a.m. and doing all these things that you hear. It's like, we all just have to honor our body. And I think I finally have come to a place where I'm like, I need to sleep. So, whether that's like a meeting or adjusting my schedule, it's just been game changing for me. So I can go on and about it, but I'd love to hear obviously actually, you're dialing back in your sleep because you just had a baby. She's a little over a year, but tell me more about like how you're feeling, how you're doing. I'm sure there's a lot of mothers who are listening that also might resonate.
Yeah, well, that's one of the toughest things about sleep advice because we hear it, and truly sleep is probably the most underrated pillar of wellness. I think it's even before nutrition, it's before exercise. If your sleep is off, everything is off. The toughest thing for moms is that a lot of the advice that's given out there is just not applicable to them.
Yeah.
We can do all the things. We can, limit light exposure at night. We can, turn off our screens, everything. But the baby's probably still waking up a few times a night. So I think that what moms can do is they can do everything else. Really take the time to support their nutrition, meditate when they can, get the baby on a schedule as much as they can, and just know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm finally getting my sleep back, but really taking that time, even as much as I want to just doom scroll at the end of the day, taking that time to like actively relax my nervous system has been super game changing. And to the point of light exposure at night, your body has melatonin receptors everywhere. And so if you have a lot of light coming in, it's going to activate cortisol. It's going to make your melatonin go lower. You want your melatonin to be higher at night. So really limiting that light exposure is super key.
Yeah, totally. And what I'm excited about these interviews that we're doing, I know this is going to be our first one, but a lot of the women, they're also moms because I know, I kind of talk about my sleep regimen. I don't have kids, and we get so many people messaging us like, well, what do you do if you're a mom? So we talk all about this of just, the realities of motherhood or busy lives and how you can incorporate, certain wellness rituals that can actually make a difference. And sometimes it can feel overwhelming. I know, at least for me. So I think Kay and I are just so passionate about what are like tactical things you can actually implement, right? So I'm just super pumped about our interviews because I actually think it can be super beneficial and really be game changing.
And that is the perfect segue into today's guest, Dr. Stephanie Estima. And in this conversation, we talk about a lot. We talk about sex, we talk about exercise, cycle syncing, joy, pleasure, perimenopause. We talk about it all.
I love it. And Dr. Stephanie Estima is a dear friend of ours, and I'm just going to read her bio quickly because she's so impressive. She's also the founder of Hello Betty, a community centered around female empowerment through health and business coaching. She is a doctor of chiropractic with a special interest in metabolism, body composition, functional neurology, and female physiology. She also has a podcast called The Host of the Better Podcast with Dr. Stephanie, and she features the world's top voices in health and wellness, and we love it. And she's also the creator of her signature female-centric ketogenic protocol, the Estima diet, where she's helped thousands of women regulate hormones, reduce adiposity, and get off medications. And we're going to talk all about that today as well. And she's also the author of her recent best-selling book, The Betty Body, where she shares her proven strategies to help women jumpstart and calibrate their metabolism, revive their libidos, and elevate their emotional well-being.
One of the most mind-blowing things that I've learned from Dr. Stephanie is the difference between the male and female brain.
Yeah.
She once explained to me that the male brain actually has more serotonin than the female brain, which is why women need more feedback in life. They need feedback from relationships. They need feedback from their friends. They need more feedback at work. And so there's actually profound differences between the male and female brain. And we go into that in this episode.
Yeah. And what I love so much about this interview too, and something I didn't know about this until kind of Stephanie came into our orbit, is how we can optimize our workouts with our cycles, right? Like, it is constantly changing every day. There's sometimes where we feel great and more energized, and sometimes we feel a little less energized. It's like, how can we optimize how we're working out with how we're feeling in our cycle? So that's been super helpful for me. And we get all into that today as well.
Another thing we touch on in this episode is perimenopause. And Dr. Estima actually provides a plan for people who are going through perimenopause because it can feel like a huge transition. And she provides a very realistic perspective of what happens to the body during this time and how we can use lifestyle, diet, and exercise to really make that time in our lives more manageable. So if you are going through if you're going through perimenopause, or, that is on the horizon, this episode is a must.
Yes. I think, both of us left this episode feeling just super motivated and inspired from so many different angles, right? From like a spiritual angle, nutritional, mental, joyful. I think this is going to be a really fun, wide-ranging interview. So
let's get into it. Why is it that women are so much more impacted by stress than men?
Oh, this is a good one. I think that there's a couple of reasons. I think that, and we can look at this from a couple of different lenses, right? So when we think about, maybe we'll start like more generally, and then we can kind of get really specific into like the metabolical and physiological implications. But I think from a cultural perspective, we were actually just talking about this before we started recording, is that I think there's a lot more pressure, let's say, on women to show up a certain way, look a certain way, fall into a certain bucket, let's say. So, we have like currently, there's a couple of very salient 50-year-olds on, like we have Jennifer Aniston on the cover of a magazine. We have Jennifer Lopez on the cover of another magazine, both in their 50s. They look fabulous. Like, both of them look fabulous. And I think actually Nicole Kidman might also be on a cover as well, all showing their abs, right? All showing like how lean they are. And I think that when we think about, okay, well, what constitutes cover worthy? And we look at what's available. So we say, oh, okay, there's some 50-year-olds. That's, first of all, amazing that we have some 50-year-olds on covers. That's progress. And when you look at these women, we see women that have abs, probably have a chef, probably have trainers, probably have, maybe some Botox or some help, like in the plastics department, maybe or maybe not, I don't know. And so we see this, and this becomes like the ideal. Like, if you're a cover-worthy individual as a woman over 50, like, this is kind of what we're looking for. So I think that there's a social or a cultural stress around like the definitive, like what's beauty and what's beautiful. So we have, and I'll say this in my practice and in my experience with women, one of my goals with them is to actually get them to eat more, because I get women who have been eating 1,100 calories for 4 decades, and they're wondering why they have, like they're gaining weight, and the things, why initially, was an adaptive response where they had they lost the weight, they were feeling better, and then they've just done it for so long that now it's become a maladaptive response. And I was, I use the example of Gabor Mate, who talks about this in the context of trauma, right? So you have a child, let's say, who is exposed to some adverse childhood event, and maybe they disassociate, right? So they become numb, they're quiet, what have you. In the moment, it's an adaptive response. But in adulthood, it becomes a maladaptive response. I would argue that the same is true for things like chronic caloric restriction. Mm-hmm. There's going to be an adaptive period where you're going to get a lot of benefit from it. You're going to lose weight. You're going to, you reduce your overall adiposity. Maybe your insulin sensitivity is going to improve. Like, hormones are going to, all that's going to improve. And then if you're doing it without a plan and without strategy, it becomes maladaptive over time. So women have this sort of cultural bucket that they have to adhere to, let's say, or be subject to bias and judgment and people making silly comments on your Instagram page. We were also talking about that pre-recording. And then I would also and then when we think about some of the chemical and physiological challenges that a woman embarks over the course of her life. So first we have a menstrual cycle, like obviously one of the most obvious distinctions between males and females. So we're different. We have a different hormonal composition over the course of our month. And we do that like for 40 years. So if you are a woman who is trying to white knuckle her way through her menstrual cycle without understanding the ebbs and flows, let's say, of how we have this different hormonal landscape, not only, over the month, but literally week to week and day to day, we are different versus our male counterparts who are kind of like same, right? Like they're sort of the same like they sort of have a bit more of a steady state where they have a bit more of a, I always describe men and women like men are like the sun, and women are like the moon, right? So men have this very established circadian rhythm and they do that day in and day out. And women, we don't necessarily cycle through all of our hormones on a day-to-day basis the way that the guys do. We do it over the course of about 29 and a half days, about the lunar cycle, right? About the length of it takes for a new moon to new moon. So we have a menstrual cycle, and then you throw in complexities, or we'll say demands or stressors like pregnancy. So getting pregnant, staying pregnant, delivering a baby, a feat unto itself. And then and then it's like, even when you have the baby, you do the pregnancy, you do the labor, and then you have to raise the child. So it's like, then you have another human around. So then you have the chronic sleep deprivation, the worrying, that when the baby's sick at night, you're the one more likely, if assuming that there's a heterosexual relationship, let's say, or maybe you're you identify more female, let's say, than your partner. It's more likely that you are going to be the primary caregiver for that child. Overnight cleaning, holding the baby when they have nightmares or night terrors or what have you. And then, I haven't even mentioned breastfeeding. Again, beautiful gift. Like, what a beautiful gift that we have to give to our children, and nutritionally depleting you in the process, right? And then you do that one time, then you do it again because you have a second child, maybe you have a third child, or there's a miscarriage or something like that. And I think the the accumulation of these stressors and demands over the arc of a woman's life. I haven't even gotten to perimenopause and menopause yet, but this is why we tend to be more stressed, let's say, than our male counterparts. Now, the beautiful thing about women is that we do seem to, your question was regarding Peter Attia, who I'm a huge fan of, by the way, and I think he does a lot of great work. What we know about cardiovascular disease in women versus men is that there does seem to be a phasic shift in terms of onset of CVD versus our male counterparts. So we do seem to there is a cardioprotective effect that we have in our fertile years under the protective influence of estrogen. So there's like one area where we can kind of raise the roof a little bit and say, yay, here's a place where we excel. However, menopause, where we see a rapid and steady decline of our primary, like these sex hormones, like progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen, this is where we start to see levels of cardiovascular disease. If we're not being careful and we don't have a strategy and a plan, this is where we start to see that incidence start to rapidly rise, such that we catch up to our male counterparts. And it is still like we always kind of think of like, what's the big killers in women? And I think a lot of women, or a lot of people, might default to say something like breast cancer, and the answer is no. It's actually cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular insults. It is the number one killer for women. Yeah.
So you talked about all these different buckets that women go through in terms of stress, right? From a cultural perspective, from just hormonal cycles to postpartum to perimenopause, menopause. At a high level, what are some things that you recommend in terms of how women can build their stress resilience in all these facets of life?
Oh, this is a good question. Oh, we're going to spend some time here.
Yes,
okay,
please.
All right. So I think that, when we're thinking about optimizing human performance. And in this specific, we're having a conversation around female performance and female optimization. You are correct to identify that probably one of the most important things is to get a handle on our stress. So what does that mean? Stress is kind of this like nebulous term. You sort of have this visual of like someone red in the face or yelling or, really high strung maybe. And I think that it is, I've described some of the big life events like pregnancy and delivery and breastfeeding and taking care of a newborn, but it is really management of the day-to-day insults that I think where we can really win at stress management. So for example, one of the things that I will often start to unpack with a patient, let's say when they start working with me, there's sort of three different main verticals. So one is like nutrition, right? Their relationship with food, how they're eating, how often they're eating, what they're eating, their exercise and their movement. So how they're training, right? So many, and I'll say that I was just talking about this. I coach healthcare practitioners, and I was just on a coaching call with them just prior to our time here. So many women are, we'll say, prioritizing cardiovascular work over resistance training. And I hope that we'll have some time to kind of unpack why resistance training is so important for women, talking about that cardiovascular, like growing that cardiac, like growing like the cardiac tissue, pericardial tissue, and like the skeletal system, like growing and building our lean muscle mass is super important. And then of course with that, like the musculoskeletal system, where the bones go, where the muscles go, so the bones go as well. So we have these different buckets, like I was saying. So we have this movement. So I like to look at how they're moving. So what is their exercise regimen? We mentioned cardiovascular. A lot of women will prioritize more cardio over resistance training. And then what's your just base level of movement? So the non-exercise activity that you're doing. So this is called NEAT. We'll look at this as like, how many steps are you kind of taking? What are your random sort of movements? So like if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, you can kind of see my hands moving around. That's sort of my inner Italian, coming out where like I'm talking with my hands. So what are these kind of spontaneous movements that are happening through the day? So is it low level activity? Is it gardening? Is it cleaning up the kitchen, washing the dishes, doing the laundry? All these little kind of movements that we don't necessarily count as cardio or activity. This is actually, in my opinion, like sort of like the golden goose, right? Like this is actually where we can make a significant impact on the lives of so many women if we are just naturally improving their NEAT. And then the third bucket, to your original question, Yasmin, is around stress management. So I think that all of those things are going to help reduce stress. Like if you're eating, a whole food diet that you can kind of do consistently, if you have a movement program that you can do consistently, these are going to help endow you with a better ability to deal with some of the demands in your life. And then there are specific techniques for stress management. So I am a really big fan of meditation. I think that that's really important. I know there's a lot of guests that maybe you and your group have all spoken to. I know Dr. Mark Hyman is a big fan of them. I'm very good friends with Emily Fletcher, who's the founder of Ziva Meditation. Fabulous teacher on meditation as well. And then the other thing that I really like that I've been giving to a lot of, particularly my type A women, is like a type of deep, like non-sleep kind of deep rest. So like a yoga nidra type of protocol. And honestly, you can just there's a couple of YouTube links that I found. I've just saved on my computer. I'll share them with you if you want to put them in the show notes, that I'll literally just give to patients. It's like a 10-minute little thing, 2:00 in the afternoon when they're about to go pick up, they're about to pick up the kids. We know that they're starting to get riled up for all the evening activities and the homework and the soccer and all the things. Like a 10-minute little reset, 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I find is very, very doable. So people can do it over time, which is kind of a big deal. It's easy. There's a low barrier to entry. You don't need a lot of skill to be able to do it. You just literally lie on the couch and pop on the YouTube video and listen to it for 10 minutes. And so that, that's going to help with the consistency of the habit as well.
What about the role of pleasure in day-to-day life. Typically, when we think of pleasure, we think of sexual pleasure, which is definitely part of it. But pleasure is something that I don't think a lot of women think about, but it's actually so beneficial for stress resilience.
Yeah, what a great question. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think pleasure and joy, these are two words that, when a lot of women that are listening to this will say, yeah, like I know what those words mean. Like I get, like cerebrally, I understand what she's saying. Pleasure and joy. It's like some kind of happiness, right? But I don't think that those words are necessarily embodied and experienced somatically for many women on a day-to-day basis. So yes, you're right. Sexual pleasure, of course, is very important. I talk about this in my book, The Betty Body, shameless plug for my book, The Betty Body. But I talk about this idea of, specifically with sexual pleasure, that as a woman, whether or not you have children, whether or not you want children, we have this, we'll say, womb space, right? Which is the ultimate creator, right? It creates life, right? So whether you want to create life or you want to give birth to a new business or a new idea, accessing the creative prowess of our womb space. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is through sexual pleasure. I talk about masturbation and vibrators and all like the toys and things that you might think about embodying. These are really, really important. Not only, I mean, we can talk about all the boring stuff about like it improves your heart rate, improves your oxygen saturation, your blood pressure goes down, your sympathetic dominance, like you tend to balance out the nervous system between the parasympathetic and sympathetic firing, the activation in the motor cortex, like all of these great things happen when we orgasm, the release of oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin and all the things. Okay. But if we're talking about it just from a human experience perspective, very, very important. But there are, to your point, there are other ways to experience pleasure. So for me, for example, one of the things that gives me a lot of pleasure is my evening routine. Like I like to double cleanse, like taking off all my makeup, and then I put on my oils and I do my little gua sha little thing on my face. And, it's like probably 10 minutes maybe in total. But I just feel like I have my life together when I do it. And I feel so happy and in a way proud of myself. The other thing that I actually love doing is I always like to make sure that my nails are done. So just, it might just be a quick little file, a little color, those things give me a lot of pleasure. And there's not a high barrier to entry for that. Right now where I live in Toronto, Canada, it's fall. So the colors are just like spectacular. So going for a walk and just looking at the trees that were once green and now, beautiful, burnt oranges and yellows. And it's lovely. So those are, a couple of different ways that you might think about bringing joy and pleasure into your daily life. And it can be with someone, if you have a partner, you can go for a walk with your partner. If there's a sexual relationship, of course, that can be shared between you two. But having a stated and deliberate plan for bringing pleasure into your life is really important. And a lot of women are like, okay, I get it, but I have like the soccer thing in the evening and I got to cook and I got to clean and I got to do my career thing and all that. So one of the things I'll have women start off by doing, just as an actionable item for your audience, is like create a desire list. Like, what is it that you want? Like, we don't even think about that. We don't even think, like, what do you want? Like, what do you want to do? Is it like, do you want to like travel? Is it that you want to learn how to take photography? I remember my partner and I, we went to a painting class one evening where I took just like an image and I was drawing it on a canvas. And it was so pleasurable. Yeah. It was like, oh my gosh, I just have all of this time to focus on drawing this image. It was beautiful. So think about what are some of the things that you desire. It could be experiential, right? So like going to a pottery class or a painting class. It could be material. Like I really would love this kind of look in my bedroom, and so maybe I'll buy a couple of pillows or, toys or, whatever it is to make that bedroom like a sanctuary to me. And write them down. And it's interesting, as you start to write them down and maybe you have a pleasure practice or a manifestation practice to kind of call them in, it's interesting to kind of go back to them and say, oh yeah, I did, like, these are all the things that I have now, or I did those things, or, so I think that that's a good way to start if you're sort of lost in the, where to start with pleasure.
One of my favorite videos, if you're listening and you haven't checked it out, is Dr. Stephanie Estima with Jim Quick talking about the male and female brain. Right. And in there, you say that sex is actually more important for women than it is for men.
Agreed.
And I think so many women are probably shocked to hear that, because typically you think of men being more sex obsessed. But can you get into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about sexuality and like some of the benefits of sex, so I've already kind of mentioned a few of them, right? So like when we're in a regular, or you're orgasming, I should say, regularly, it's all those things that I talked about, all of those vitals where we see heart rate and respiratory rate and oxygen saturation and blood pressure, all these things get better. Now it is true that men have more testosterone than women do. So of course, their receptivity to and thinking about sex, because testosterone is very famous for libido. So men have more testosterone, so they're going to have, let's say a baseline, a higher libido than women. However, women are we very much take cues from our environment, and our when we think about our dopamine and our serotonin levels, what I was explaining in that video with Jim is that women need typically more encouragement along the way. So for a guy, you might say to him, and I noticed this when I was in clinical practice. Let's say I had a guy come in and he had some issue, like a shoulder issue or whatever. I would say, okay, you need to do this, and we're going to reevaluate you in a month. And he would just go off and do the rehab exercises. He would do the thing and he would come back after the month. We'd retest him and I'd be like, great job. Okay, so this is the next piece. And then he'd go and he'd do it and come back. So men are typically more internally motivated, we'll say, okay? For a woman, let's say with the same shoulder injury, I couldn't just say to her, you need to do these 4 exercises, 4 times a week, come back and see me in a month. I would need to check in with her every couple of days to give her encouragement, to see how she's doing, to see how she's feeling. Partly, again, because men have that more steady state. They're kind of the same all the time. Women have these ebbs and flows in their mood and their energy and their motivation as a function of their menstrual cycle. So I found very early on in practice that I needed to give my women more attention. And so this is what I was getting at with this: women need twice as much sex as men, because we also are going to derive so much positive reinforcement from our partners, more so than our male counterparts, right? So we are going to derive so much more positive reinforcement from, all the things that sex entails, right? The intimacy, the vulnerability, the pleasure. And we're going to be, of course, and this is assuming that you are in a healthy relationship, that you feel supported and nurtured and loved. But you are going to, if you feel supported and you're getting that positive reinforcement from your partner, you are going to come back for more and more and more. So like, sort of the tongue in cheek there is like, you're going to chase the sex like the animal that you are, because you are going to want that dopamine hit. You are going to want that feeling, those feelings of serotonin, those like feeling like, gosh, like I feel so loved. I'm getting this positive reinforcement from my environment. In this case, my partner is giving me this positive reinforcement. So I do think that it's important for women to really recognize, we always hear these tropes like, oh, chocolate, I prefer chocolate over sex. And it's like, well, what you're getting from chocolate is a transient baseline increase in dopamine, which is great, but depending on how quickly you clear the dopamine from the receptor, like we could be talking like minutes. Like you're going to get a little bump for like a couple of minutes. Some people a little slower, so maybe it's a little longer than that. But when you have a relationship with someone and you're in pursuit, like you're making out and all of that, so you're going to get this longer elevated increase in dopamine, actually about 2 times above baseline. And then if there's orgasm or there's climax, you're also going to get the benefit of oxytocin. Chocolate doesn't do that, by the way. So chocolate doesn't do the oxytocin bit. So the oxytocin is kind of like the love. It's called the love hormone, right? The bonding hormone. We see high levels of oxytocin released post-climax, men and women. You'll also see high oxytocin like in like parent-child relationships, that kind of thing. So oxytocin also very important in both the dopaminergic and the serotonergic systems. We used to only think that it was like serotonin, and of course it is involved in serotonin. But again, in that pursuit, like when I was saying you're going to chase the sex like the animal that you are, the more oxytocin you release post-climax, the more likely you are to actually go and repeat those behaviors again. So you can get that neurochemical soup that's being released from the activity of, making love or, being with your partner.
I love this. I feel like we can go even deeper into this for a whole nother podcast session, but I want to transition over to another important topic. In addition to sex, you mentioned earlier in the interview, the importance of resistance training and strength training for women. So can you talk more about how that really impacts our brain, body, and hormones?
One of my favorite topics for sure. I think when we're thinking about aging well, not necessarily anti-aging, because you can't really not age. All of us are aging every single second, right? But if you want to age well, I think that part of your strategy needs to include resistance training. So my background is I'm a doctor of chiropractic by training. So like the neuromusculoskeletal system is where I love to nerd out. And certainly when we are training, just from a neurophysiological perspective, there's information coming from the muscle, let's say, coming back up to the brain in the motor cortex, right? And then we have there's sensory information coming up, and then there's motor information coming down. So we are stimulating the front part of the brain. It's called the frontal lobe. The motor cortex, of course, is part of the frontal lobe. And then right in front of the motor cortex is an area called the prefrontal cortex. So every time that you are working out, you are resistance training or generally moving your body, but we're going to focus on resistance training for a moment. You are going to be increasing the activity to the frontal lobe, which is an important, from a brain-based perspective. The frontal lobe is basically your parent. It's the parent part of your brain. It's the part that develops last. It's involved in inhibiting lower brain centers. So, if you've ever heard of like the limbic system, which is kind of a bit more, it's often called like the lizard brain maybe, or like more of a primitive part of the brain. The frontal lobe in its strength works to inhibit some of these lower brain centers. So it keeps you sort of, it's part of it's a direct line into your humanity. It's what keeps us human. It's what keeps us thinking. Mm-hmm. Often, if you've ever seen someone with road rage, let's say, or if you've ever yelled at your kids or yelled at your partner or just lost your temper, what has happened in that moment is your frontal lobe is actually not working to inhibit your limbic system, and you are getting very primal, maybe very defensive, maybe very fearful, and we have this sort of limbic system that takes over. So strengthening the frontal lobe, always a good idea, right? As I mentioned, your frontal lobe is a direct connection to your humanity. Keeps us human. It allows us to empathize with others. So this is like a whole other rabbit hole that I won't go down. But in lieu of like the pandemic and the politics and the left versus right and the anti versus pro and the this versus that, often what we're seeing there is a divide. Well, there's a divide and conquer there, right? It's like you're either with us or you're against us. When we are in our frontal lobe, you can say, okay, Yasmin, I disagree with you, but tell me more. Let me understand a little bit about where you're coming from. right? Like if you're a Republican, let me understand where this Democrat's coming from. If you're pro-life, let me understand where this pro-choice person is coming from, et cetera. Not to say that I agree with any of those stances, but I do think that there has been a lot of like othering that has happened with the pandemic. You're either a pro-masker or you're anti-masker. You're a pro-vaccine or you're an anti-vaccine. And I think that when you are not using your frontal lobe, it can be very easy, or your frontal lobe is not as strong as it should be, we'll say. Your
So are
ability
90% of people walking around with a messed up frontal lobe?
I mean, it can seem like that. It can seem like that, especially if you're just on Instagram or Twitter, which are like the worst neighborhoods on the planet, really, to be in. I do think that I think what has been lost, and I understand why, is the ability to see the person across the aisle and say, like, I disagree with you, and you can still come to dinner. You don't have to, you can still come to Thanksgiving dinner, like, even though we don't agree. I think that there has been a little bit of that has been lost. And I understand why. People are scared, right? I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but like, people are scared. Like I remember when the pandemic started, I was keeping my Amazon packages stayed on the porch for I was like, I don't know. It's supposed to live on, isn't
Forgot
it
about
supposed
all
to live
that.
in cardboard? Yeah. Like I had my partner, he would go out shopping, and when he came home, I was like, take all your clothes off right up the stairs. We got to wash these clothes. You've been out, we didn't know. Right. So people were very, very scared. So back to resistance training and why it helps your frontal lobe. I can get off on these little tangents, so I appreciate you allowing me to do so. But it helps with your humanity, helps with your empathy, helps with your inhibition. It also, from a chemical perspective, also helps your brain grow. So there is kind of this miracle grow that we like to call BDNF, which is just short form for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. There are other growth factors as well that are activated when you are training that help to keep, if there's I always joke, like if there's one organ you want like big, and juicy over the course of your life, it's your brain, right? We want the brain to grow, not shrink, right? Or at least maintain, but ideally, kind of grow as we get older, because the natural inclination is for things to decline and for things to atrophy with time. So that's the brain benefits. In terms of course, the body benefits, when you put on lean muscle mass, as we age, again, things kind of get worse if you're not working on it. We can become more insulin resistant, and we do become more insulin resistant as we age. So it's important when you're training and you're putting on lean muscle mass, it allows your body as a whole, because your skeletal muscle, there's a lot of skeletal muscle, allows for you to be a better glucose disposal agent. You can get rid of the glucose, let's say, if you've exogenously had like whatever, proteins and carbohydrates and whatever, or carbohydrates like will directly, their constituents are glucose. Your muscles can help to dispose of that excess glucose so that your pancreas is not working as hard and like the output of insulin is not as high, right? So that's really important to consider as well from like a metabolic perspective. From an immune perspective, of course, every time you contract a muscle, we are releasing something called a myokine, which is going to help to tamper down or clamp down on some of these pro-inflammatory pathways, which can become deranged as well as we age. And then finally, I'll say again, I like to think about this, and this is like, I've taken a bit of a chapter from Peter Attia here. He talks about the, what does he call them? Like the centenarian Olympics. Yeah, I think, the centenarian Olympics, where he wants to be like 100 and like he's like defined all these categories that he wants to be able to do. I'm like, oh, that's a really good idea. I don't want to compete in an Olympics, with centenarian, but I want to be the favorite grandmother. Like I definitely want, like I want to be, I hope that I'll be blessed to be a grandmother one day. And that means that I need to be able to tell my sons and, their partners, you guys go to work today. Don't worry about it. Like, it's me and the baby today. Like, I need to be able to pick the baby up out of a crib. I need to be able to put them in a car seat. I need to be able to take them to the playground. I need to get on the floor and play with them and be able to get up without using my hands or like minimal use of my hands. I need to be flexible and pliable and mobile and strong. So I think about resistance training not only to make you look good now. I mean, from a vain, if I cannot appeal to your longevity, mind, I will appeal to your aesthetic, like you're going to look good, but also, when you are 80, 70, 80, 90, I don't think that people really appreciate how quickly things can decline in those years if we're not actively doing something right now, let's say in our 30s, 40s, and 50s. Because if you don't really do anything in your 30s, like not much happens, right? Maybe we start to notice it a little bit more in our 40s as we're moving into perimenopause. And then we really start to notice things 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So it's, I like to start now for that kind of long-term view on like being the favorite grandmother.
I love that.
I've never been so motivated to continue my strength training after listening to you, Stephanie. Honestly, I'm going to get that into place. So I'm also curious, with women's hormones changing throughout the month, how do you really adjust for training leading up to and during your cycle?
Sure. Yeah. So generally, the overall goal whenever you're training is a concept called progressive overload, meaning that you are over the course of time, not just in a month, but over the course of, let's say 6 months, 9 months, a year, a decade, you are getting stronger with time. Now, for a woman, we have to think about the different hormonal environments that she might be training in. So not all cycles are the same, right? So, your cycle might be 32 days, mine might be 27, or you have a perimenopausal woman where her cycles maybe are all over the place. But generally what we want to be thinking about is in our bleed week, so the week where we are actively shedding that endometrial lining. Depending on, how bad day one, like some women are like, I just can't do anything on day one, like the cramping, the lethargy, so some gentle, usually if that's the case, like some gentle, like that NEAT, right? So like just increasing a lot of walking. I actually typically do that, like first day of my period. I actually just I find that rocking of the sacrum, like long walks really, really help. Yeah. So I love to go for long walks kind of day one. I typically take a day off of training that day. But as you kind of get into the, of the flow, into the sort of flow, let's say, pun intended, of your period, you might think about starting to lift like moderate weights. So moderate is a subjective term. Like moderate for me is going to be different for Yasmin. It's going to be different for all of us on this call. It might be different, right? The way that I would define moderate is that you are able to lift somewhere between like your set, let's say you're doing squats. You're going to be able to punch out somewhere between 8 and 12 repetitions. And by the end, let's say let's say it's 12. So at the end of that 12th rep, you have like one to, if I said you have to do one more, you could do one more, but not much more than that. Right, maybe up to a maximum of, if I said, okay, we've done 12, like, can you do 3 more? You should be able to do like somewhere between 1 and 3 more. Or if I said, rate this out of 10, you might say, well, that's like a 9, right? So the weight needs to be heavy enough that you can execute with perfect form, because we don't want to injure ourselves. And injuries often happen in those last 3 reps when we're pushing and our egos are getting in the way. So perfect form, or close to perfect as you can. And if I said to you, how many more reps do you have in reserve, right? This is called RIR, reps in reserve. You might say 1 to 3. Like, I have 3 more left in me max, 1 more left in me max. So you'll have to play a little bit, like on the squat rack or, whatever exercise you're doing, to figure out what that weight is for you. And then over time, you want that weight it should feel subjectively lighter, meaning that your reps in reserve is going to increase. Or if I said rated out of 10, your rate of perceived exertion, which is your RPE, you might say, oh, it used to be a 9, but now it's kind of like a 7. So that would be a time for you to kind of bump up the weight. Maybe we want to make it a little harder, right? So that's a moderate That would be how I would define moderate. So moderate in bleed week, okay? In your pre-ovulatory week, or week 2 of your cycle, we have a slightly different hormonal environment here, obviously, than we do in our bleed week. We see there's 2 main events that happen hormonally here. We see estradiol peak, right? So estradiol will go, it reaches its like apex of the entire cycle here. So I've seen, depends on the woman, but I've seen it kind of shoot up to like 400. I've seen 600 picograms per milliliter. Like it goes up really, really high. Stays elevated for about 50 hours or so, and then it comes back down. We also see a peak in testosterone here. So here is the week where you have a partner or you don't have a partner, and you're just going to be just a little bit, you're going to be more receptive to sex. You're going to be more interested in sex. This is just I always joke and say, this is the week where I'm chasing Giovanni, like my partner's name is Giovanni. I'm chasing Gio like around the kitchen table. I'm like, where are you? Like it's, it's time to go. So, testosterone is going to peak this week. From a training perspective, I actually like to profit really from that peak in both these 2 anabolic hormones, right? Like estradiol is an anabolic hormone, so is testosterone. So I like a woman to keep actually the same exercises. So she might be training 4 times a week, 2 uppers, 2 lowers, and it's the exact same moves, but she's changing the rep range. So maybe last week she was doing 12, and now maybe this week she's doing 7, right? So she's making the weight heavier, like much heavier. Same question. If you did 7, how many reps in reserve do you have left? Like how many, like maybe 1 more? Or out of 10, what is this 0 to 10? And she should say like, this is an 8 or a 9. So the weight has to get significantly higher there. So there's going to be more mechanical, like you're going to have more tension, like you're going to have more load and more mechanical tension, probably more ripping of the muscle fiber, but that's good. That's how muscles grow. We break them down and then the body repairs them and builds them back up. Post-ovulation. So ovulation is kind of somewhere for most women around 14 to 6, like day 14 or day 16, kind of some at the midpoint of their cycle. Some women can feel it. So some women can actually feel that release of the egg from the follicle. Some women experience cramping. We call it Mittelsmärch, which is the German words for middle and smirch pain. And there can be some cramping, which is normal. And then we move from ovulation into the luteal phase. So week 3 for someone who is training, when we actually look at the hormonal environment, it looks very similar to week 1. We see low estrogen in the beginning, and then it kind of rises again. So I like to return her same program, just back to that moderate rep range. And then in week 4, which is the week before her cycle, the week before she starts to bleed, this is probably the week for most women if they're going to experience bloating, headaches, irritability, sleeplessness, like kind of that myriad of that cluster, that constellation of PMS, like premenstrual syndrome, like those symptoms. This is probably when she's going to experience them the most. So what I like to do is actually game the system a little bit. And she's probably not like kind of in the mood to lift really, really heavy. She might be able to do moderate weights, which is great. I actually like in week 4, again, same program, but I like the reps to change. So I like the reps to actually be higher. So somewhere between 15 reps, 20 reps, even up to 30 reps. Again, with those same questions, like reps in reserve, 1 to 3, out of 10, you should be an 8 or above. Okay. All of these different ways of training. Okay. So whether it's 8 to 12, 5 to 7, 15 to 30, as long as you're approaching failure, you're not at failure, muscle failure, but you're approaching muscle failure or like complete muscle fatigue, you will grow your muscles. So there's I know this is a terrible saying, but there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, right? There's a lot, it's like a terrible saying, but it's like there's a lot of different ways to achieve hypertrophy. And I like this cadence because it honors the different the different hormonal milieu that a woman is bathing in that particular week. And we're still moving towards that hypertrophy of the muscle. And so there's a couple of different, things that I talk about in the book, but that would be one of them. I would say approaching muscle fatigue, irrespective of the reps, very, very important. And then a minimum of like 10 sets per week per muscle group, right? So if you want to, let's say, grow your glutes, I don't think 10 is enough, but like it has to be a minimum of 10 per week of any given like glute building exercise, squats, lunges, hip thrusters, all that kind of stuff.
I'll see you guys later. I'm going to go to the gym now.
I know I'm like 10 for each muscle group.
Calculating in my head, like how much do I do?
Well, that's the beauty of compound movements. Okay. So that's the other thing I want to mention is, whenever you're thinking about exercise design. So if you're thinking, okay, like I got to work out, she just said 10 per muscle group. Like how many muscle groups do we have? Oh my God, I'm going to be in the gym forever. So compound movements are movements like a squat or a lunge that are like multi-joint, right? So like a squat, for example, we're seeing hip flexion, we're seeing knee flexion, we're seeing tibial torsion, we're seeing ankle dorsiflexion, like we're seeing many joints, and many muscles recruited for that one particular exercise. So the more compound movements, let's say squats and lunges, I'd include deadlifts, in that category, hip thrusts. And we're just talking about the lower body, so I'm just throwing out a couple lower body examples. These are all examples of if we think about the muscles that are worked in a squat, right? It's going to be the erector spinae group. It's going to be the tensor fascia lata. It's going to be the glute max, min, medius. It's going to be hamstrings. It's going to be like all of them. There's so many muscles that are worked. So you don't need to, spend hours and hours and hours and days and days and days in the gym, especially if your workout design has a lot of compound movements to them.
So we're talking essentially, I think you said twice a week upper, twice a week lower, or did I just make that up?
No, I said 4 times. I think ideally, or we'll say this, minimum viable product is 3 times a week. Like if you're in the gym thrice weekly, you're doing really well. And that can be an upper body, a lower body, and a full body. You're going to get the amount of benefit if you're not doing any, or maybe you're training once, let's say, and everything else is cardio. If you slightly like change the constitution of the way that you're moving from, let's say 3 times, like maybe it's 1 time of training and you move that up to 3, the benefits that you're going to see are astounding. Now, ideally you want to, that's kind of like that's your MVP. That's your minimum viable thing that you want to be punching out. Ideally, I would say 4 is better. 4 is better than 3. And in some cases, 5 is better than 4. But I don't work out more, or I don't often prescribe more than 5 resistance training days per week, because we also need to consider recovery. And this is actually, when we're talking about muscle growth, this is actually where all the magic happens, right? It's the days off where the muscles grow. Like the days in the gym are when we are breaking down those muscle groups. And then when we take a break from them, that's all that recovery that's happening is where those muscles hypertrophy. So you do have to consider and honor your body's need for rest and recovery as well.
Yasmin and I have talked to a few women lately who are interested in BIA, and what they tell us is typically the same thing. I know something is up. My hair isn't the same. I'm gaining weight. My period's starting to become a little bit all over the place. I'm not sleeping as well. They're just really noticing all of these changes, and sometimes it feels very suddenly. Yeah. So my question is, are those changes inevitable?
In perimenopause, to your point, a lot of women do notice some of these changes that you're describing. Like all of a sudden they can't sleep, and all of a sudden they are gaining weight, and all of a sudden their hair is falling out, and all of a sudden, it seems like some of these changes do happen overnight. I would argue that they don't happen overnight, but they're sort of subclinical. Like things have been sort of happening on a subclinical, like non-detect, like they haven't been enough yet for you to be able to figure out, hey, something's happening, which is why the nutrition and the resistance training piece, the best time to start resistance training was 10 years ago. And the second best time is today, right? So if you're not doing it, just start. So I would say that for some women, it is really a roller coaster, but we can attenuate the severity, the duration, and even the frequency of the symptoms by some of the things that we've been talking about. So the resistance training being one of them. I would also say your nutrition is going to be really important. A lot of times we chalk up things like hot flashes, let's say, to, the sort of ever-changing levels in estrogen. And that's true. Estrogen does regulate, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So wild swings in estradiol certainly can cause a, wild dilation or constriction, let's say, in the arterial wall. And we also want to consider other things like liver health and microbiome health as well. The liver, primarily because it is the center for detoxification, and I don't mean like the master cleanse, cayenne pepper, lemon, maple syrup, whatever that is, right? Like, I don't mean like a detox that you see kind of celebrities like talking. I mean like there's like an actual process of detoxification, where your liver is involved. Like, it will take toxins and it will make them more water soluble so that we can throw them like out to the emunctories, or we can get rid of them, right? And there's also, the metabolism. Like, your liver is also involved in the metabolism of many of your sex hormones, estrogen being one of them. So if your, let's say, your genetic blueprint, let's say, is like mine. I'll tell you, like, for me, my tendency, the way that my body likes to process estrogen is suboptimal. So there's a couple of different phases of detox without boring everybody. I favor one of my estrogen metabolites, or my down, like, when you break estrogen up, one of the metabolites that I like to produce is actually a DNA damaging, quinone inducing kind of like really bad form of estrogen that continues to activate. It's called a 4-OH estrone or estradiol, depending on the estrogen that you're talking about. And what it does when you produce a lot of this 4-OH is you will notice clinically things like really like tender breasts around, around menstruation, or right prior to bleed week, right? Because it's a receptor like this 4-OH metabolite will continue to retain its ability to activate estrogen receptors, and we don't want that, right? We want estrogen. We want to use estrogen and then lose estrogen. We don't want estrogen hanging around. We don't want estrogen receptors being activated. Yeah. So in my case, I need to make sure that I'm having a lot of green leafy vegetables, a lot of diindole compounds like that are found in green leafy vegetables that contain something called DIM, or supplement with them, so that I can kind of jump pathways. I can move to this like deleterious pathway to like a more optimized pathway. So for women in perimenopause, that would also be an area of exploration that I would be interested in. Like, what is their genetic sort of blueprint? Not that it's their destiny, but just what's the blueprint? What's the manual that they have, right? What's the, like, my manual is like, make the bad estrogen, right? So, but I can then, that's at the gene level. And then at the epigenetic level, I can say, okay, I know I make the bad estrogen, so I'm going to have lots of greens so that I can actually modify the activity of those genes, right? So liver would be one of them, like one of the areas I would look at. I would also be looking at health and integrity of the microbiome, particularly kind of subcategory, we'll say, called the estrobolome, which is basically the bacteria in the gut that are involved in estrogen metabolism. If you have too much of certain enzymes, beta-glucuronidase is one of them. You can actually take estrogen that's been like slated for elimination, deconjugate it, and it like kind of goes back into the system. So we want to make sure that there's this beta-glucuronidase in particular. It tends to be a very quite problematic for women as well, because then if you have more estrogen coming back into the system when you should have eliminated it, again, you're violating that golden rule of estrogen, which is like use it and then lose it, right? So we want to be looking at microbiome integrity. I mentioned skeletal health already, mentioned cardiac tissue already, but these are some areas that I would be looking at for a perimenopausal woman to help improve her symptoms. Now, can I look in my crystal ball and say, listen, if you do all of these things, like you're never going to feel any symptoms? Like I wish I could. For some, it really depends. So, one thing to keep in mind for the women who are listening who may be in perimenopause is first, there's a lot of things that you can do to reduce your experience or some of the negative experiences, let's say, of perimenopause. And, once and this is a little bit beyond my, this is beyond my, let's say, my prescribing ability and all that. But then I would, once we sort of move to the limits of like nutrition and fitness and stress management, maybe then there's a conversation to be had around bioidenticals, right? Or hormone replacement therapy as well. And I'm a fan of them. Like, I think that they're great. I think for some women, they can really be a lifesaver. And I think it's, there's a lot of conversation around like longevity and like aging well, or even, anti-aging. And it's like, well, how come we've poo-pooed all over hormone replacement therapy? And then we can get into well, maybe we won't today, but like the Women's Health Initiative, worst. Like the quality, I mean, it's so sad because the amount of money that was put into this initiative was so promising. We were so excited that there's finally something just for women, right? And they just mucked it up. And you still see. So basically, the Women's Health Initiative concluded that hormone replacement therapy is going to lead to this increase in all adverse outcomes, heart attacks and breast cancer and all of the things. When you start to actually look at the data and you look at the subset of women that were included versus ones who were excluded, you start to see a lot of holes that come up in the way that they designed and implemented the study and then the way that they analyzed the results. But you still, unfortunately, as a woman, if you go to your clinician today and you say, hey, I think I have some symptoms of low testosterone, or I think I have some, like, I think I might be in menopause and I'm like having these hot flashes and I just feel like if you have a clinician who sort of grew up when the WHI was released, then you are probably going to have to fight, if you get it at all, a script for a hormone replacement therapy. So.
Yeah, we talk to a lot of women who are going through perimenopause and have been dealing with that. But just even the fundamentals that you talked about, we've seen women kind of shift their symptoms a little bit. But I think just what you shared gives a lot of people hope that there are different avenues you can take depending on what you're going through. So we appreciate that. So I want to end this interview on really talking about, maybe at a high level, your top 3 tips when it comes to supporting your hormones and having healthy hormones.
Sure. I think the first piece, and maybe this is a little bit meta, but I think it's important, is just having reverence for the just vast intelligence and beauty and complexity of the female form. I mean, just having reverence. I was talking to some healthcare practitioners earlier today, and they were talking about how in week 4, week 4 of their cycle, they always notice that they're hungrier. And, prior to working with me, that they would just try to like white knuckle their way through it. Like they just were like, no, this is the calories I'm allowed. I'm not. And, my teaching is like week 4, increase your damn calories. Right. So, so these practitioners have started doing that. And they're like, it's so funny because the minute I get my period, I'm not hungry anymore. And it's like, isn't that such good information to have? Yeah. And isn't it so cool? Like, I know I sound like such a nerd, but isn't that so cool that you could like eat a house and then you get your period and you're like, I don't care about food, And like, I just think it's so beautiful. So just having reverence and like honoring the temple, if you will, this is the church, right? This is the place of worship. So worshiping really your body, I think, is important. That would be my number one thing across all verticals. And then some of the strategies that we've talked about today, like eating whole foods, not calorically restricting forever. Like if you've been having 1,200 calories since you were 12, maybe time to reevaluate. Maybe we want to talk about reverse dieting or some other ways that we can like give you more substrate so that you can actually perform in the areas of your life that you want to be performing in as a mother, in your career, having better sleep, all the things. So I would say nutrition and then movement. Like we are, as much as we are kind of plugged in and connected to technology, like we are by design designed to move, and we need to constantly stimulate our physical form. So resistance training in some capacity. I think cardiovascular work is really important as well, to a lesser degree. That is my bias. Because you will get cardiovascular training with resistance training. When you're lifting weights, there is a certain amount of cardiovascular training that happens, so you don't need to do as much of it. And then, we were talking before around finding like a joy practice or a pleasure practice. I think that that's really, really great. Like finding little moments in your day that just put a little sparkle in your step. It makes the to-do list pleasurable. It makes, because the to-do list, just in case anyone hasn't told you yet, it never ends. Like once you clear it off, it's just going to fill up with other stuff. So it's like to-do list until the end of time. So if you can enjoy that process rather than just looking forward to the day that the to-do list is never going to exist, I think that, finding ways to infuse joy into your everyday is really, really important and really special.
I love it, Stephanie. Thank you for joining us today. This was so much fun. Always so good to see you.
How are we finished already?
I know.
No.
We didn't even get through all our questions, right?
No, we skipped a bunch too.
All right. Well, I just love both of you, both what you're doing at Bia and behind her empire. I think you guys are just doing such a bang up job getting the message out there to the women that need to hear it. So I am your biggest fans as well, and always will champion the work that you're doing too.
Like exactly what you said, right back at you.
Yes.